many thanks all of you for joining us here today. Now, culture is at the heart of human existence. It's what connects the past with the present and makes connections in the present as well. It provides identity and a sense of belonging. Hence, culture has also been recognized as an enabler of growth and sustainable development, making it a key G20 talking point, placing culture at the core of policy making. This time at the G20, India will help look at four broad aspects of culture: protection and restitution of cultural property, harnessing living heritage for a sustainable future, promotion of cultural and creative industries and creative economy, and leveraging digital technologies for the protection and promotion of culture. The message being sent out is that we may be culturally diverse, but we are all unified. Joining me on the panel today to discuss the thought G20 Building Cultural Bridges, Ambassador Anil Trigunayat, former ambassador, distinguished fellow at the Vivekanand International Foundation, Dr. Vijay Jolly, former MLA and former national convener, BJP Foreign Cell and President, Delhi Study Group, Oleg Osipov, cultural counselor, director, Russian Cultural Center, New Delhi, Cedric C. Crowley, Deputy Chief of Mission, South Africa and India, Ambassador V.B. Soni, former diplomat, patriot Edin Arato, DCM, Indonesian Embassy. Many thanks, gentlemen, for being here. I'm going to start off with asking all the panelists here today to begin with their opening remarks, and I'd request all of you to keep it to 5 minutes. Ambassador Soni, why don't you start, sir?
Well, first of all, thank you very much for inviting me to this very important session. Yes. Well, it's an important day. I think the 14th of July is not only Bastille Day for France, but for us, Indian Prime Minister is actually on an official visit to that country, and I think he's creating waves. He has gone, when he went to US, he did so much to promote India. I think as the chairman of the G20 is an important thing which has happened. It has come India's way, and quite rightly so. I was in Bali in December last year for a private visit. There was a conference which was happening, and so I had to go and make my remarks there. But the impression which I got, and it was just a few days after the summit happened, that there was so much of excitement and so there was so much of confidence that with India assuming power as the, not power, really position as the chairman of this of the G20, it will steer itself in the organization in a very, very good direction because of its old historical traditions and experience. Mind you, Bandung happened in Indonesia in 1950s, and so from then on, we have been in the forefront for doing things. And so therefore the timing of this assuming power is also very important. So let me convey my brief remarks, and after that I'll be happy to answer any questions which are there. So as I said, it'll be recalled that in the wake of financial crisis that swept through Southeast Asian economies in the late 1990s, a forum for finance ministers and central bank governors was set up. Soon thereafter, G20 was upgraded to include heads of state and government. India has assumed presidency of G20 group at a time when geopolitical tensions are high, the Ukrainian crisis, and the world is witnessing economic instability, heightened food and energy insecurity, not to speak of environment degradation. India set about preparing for the next summit scheduled to be held on September 9 and 10, 2023, with proper planning in a meticulous manner. It put together an unparalleled display of global cooperation with 220 meetings and events spread across the country in 60 different cities and locations during the last 8 months. The organizers claim that as many as 18,000 delegates from 115 different nationalities have attended these events in preparation for the September 23 summit. What are India's goals for this one-year G20 presidency, and how it offers a momentous opportunity to tackle the problems facing the world? India set the ball rolling by convening the Voice of Global South Summit earlier this year, with 15 countries participating in preparation to pilot the G20 platform, the Global South Perspective, pushing for systems that ensure energy security and equity for the developing world. India is also an advocate for the inclusion of the African Union as a permanent member of G20. India wants its presidency to be inclusive, ambitious, decisive, and action-oriented. With that aim, it has decided to focus on 6 priorities. There are so many other priorities, but these are the 6 which I have taken out. The first one is green development, climate finances, and life. It plans to nudge consumers and, in turn, markets to adapt environmentally conscious practices. Resilient and inclusive growth and structural transformation by promoting labor rights and secure labor welfare, addressing the global skills gap, and so on. Then the third one is accelerating progress on sustainable development goals. India has already had success in getting the G20 members, which includes 19 countries and the European Union, on board with the goal. The group has agreed to an action plan to speed up progress on SDGs and on sustainable development lifestyles. Fourth, technological transformation and digital public infrastructure. A human-centric approach to technology and facilitate greater knowledge sharing in priority areas like digital public infrastructure, financial inclusion, and tech-enabled development in sectors ranging from agriculture to education has been proposed by India. E, next one, multilateral institutions for the 21st century. India is pushing for a more accountable, inclusive, just, equitable, and representative multipolar international system that is capable of addressing the concerns of this century. And next, women-led development, women empowerment, and representation. India is emphasizing in bringing women to leading positions to bolster socio-economic development. It has succeeded in building consensus that by 2030, the digital gender gap should be halved by addressing barriers around affordability, literacy and digital skills, accessibility, online safety, and more. To address the impending global food crisis and hunger in poor developing countries, India came up with a brilliant solution by showcasing millets as modern diet super-rich food with fortified nutritional security as a homegrown resource in the vast countryside surrounding. Participants at various G20 conferences and events greatly appreciated the multi-cuisine millet-based food options offered at these events. With this presidency, India has the perfect opportunity to amplify the issues plaguing the poor and developing world in front of the developed countries. India's effort is to bridge the gap that exists between the global north and global south on issues like climate change, renewable energy, intellectual property rights, carbon emissions, and trade. During India's presidency, the ongoing Russia-Ukraine crisis has expectedly emerged as a sticking point in the discussion of the rich and the emerging countries. India has maintained that the G20 should remain an economic and development forum, concentrating on issues like supply chains, increased inflation, and threatened growth. India has been aiming to use G20 platform to address the Ukraine conflict, strategizing for peace and a path towards reconciliation as much as possible. It is hopeful that the differences over the conflict would be resolved in time for the Leaders' Summit in September 23, so that issues of development and financial crises could be addressed in a constructive manner. Let me conclude by quoting a commentator's fond hope that the forthcoming September summit turns out to be India's moment to transform from being a rule taker to being a rule maker. Thank you very much for your attention.
Many thanks, Ambassador Soni. I now request Mr. Cedric Crowley to make his opening remarks. I think it's on, sir.
Namaste and good morning to you all, and thank you so very much to the organizers for inviting us as the South African High Commission to India to participate in this important event. Madam Moderator, thank you for your guidance, and we look forward to a very interesting session where we can share experiences. The topic of culture can at once be quite divisive, or it can create inclusiveness. And therefore the theme, G20 Building Cultural Bridges, is demonstrative of that division that can create and the importance of us as leading countries in the world to bring people together. That's what bridges do. It connects. And so from that vantage point, as a non-cultural expert, I shall make my remarks, and I'll take a slightly more political angle, I think more along the lines of Dr. Sunal Mansingh that spoke earlier, when she indicated how colonial empires looked at India. When your culture was frowned upon, when your culture was not recognized, when your culture was mocked. So equally, South Africa has the experience where arts and culture became a very and highly charged emotional issue. Charged because the cultures of others were looked down upon, were frowned upon, were not recognized. Culture as it is was weaponized, instrumentalized to convey a sense of superiority of one culture over another. So that was used, and so culture became a seed that showed division. So in our context, the people, the oppressed, as early as 1955 came together in what was called the Congress of the People, where the people articulated their vision of a new South Africa. And one of the components, you know, amongst all the things they could have addressed, economic oppression, political oppression, they also addressed the issue of culture. And they had this vision of culture in which they wrote, "The doors of learning and culture shall be opened. The government shall discover, develop, and encourage national talent for the enhancement of our cultural life. All cultural treasure of mankind," and I shall say humankind, "shall be open to all by free exchange of books, ideas, contexts, and other lands. The aim of education shall be to teach youth to love their people and their culture, to honor human brotherhood, and I will add sisterhood, liberty, and peace." And so for this reason, the promotion and protection of arts and culture has become a constitutional imperative for democratic South Africa, because it recognized that historically, arts legislation was used to diminish the arts, the status of other languages and other cultures. And the task of the new government was to elevate this back to its glory and original place. So Mandela in 1995, and accidentally we are celebrating his birthday on the 18th, and we look forward to you celebrating this UN declared Nelson Mandela International Day with us. He said, ours is a nation of warm and generous people, just like the Indian I came to know when I was posted here. its great in variety of culture and heritage, once exploited to divide our people, has been turned by them into a source of strength and richness in every sphere of life. And so that unity, the inclusivity of culture, I think was emphasized by Mandela. So arts and culture has also become, I've mentioned the first imperative, a constitutional imperative. It has also became a imperative for social cohesion. The motto on our coat of arms, and it's written in an indigenous language, and so I shall translate it to you into English. It says, diverse people unite, recognizing that, despite our divided past, we can use our culture to form one nation, and our country is fondly known as the Rainbow Nation, a term coined by former Archbishop, the deceased Archbishop Desmond Tutu. And so, each year, since 1995, we have celebrated what is called Heritage Day. And Nelson Mandela, in 1996, addressing this day, he said as follows: when our first democratically elected government decided to make Heritage Day one of our national days, we did so because we knew that our rich and varied cultural heritage has a profound power to help build our new nation. So there was a political imperative for social cohesion, and we used our diverse culture to foment a new, unified country and society. We did so knowing that the struggles against the injustice and inequities of the past are part of our national identity, he said. They are part of our culture. We knew that if indeed our nation had to rise like the proverbial phoenix from the ashes of division and conflict, we had to acknowledge those whose selfless efforts and talents were dedicated to this goal of a non-racial democracy. And so he was paying tribute to cultural figures and artists that spread the message of hope, spread the message of freedom when others were not allowed to. So it was cultural activists that did that. And so we are profoundly grateful in our country for the role art play and artists played in that connection. The third imperative is arts and culture as a developmental imperative, and that is recognized by the UN and the SDGs in SDG 11.4, where it says strengthen efforts to protect and safeguard the world's cultural and natural heritage. And so increasingly we recognize, we've heard the figures, how the creative industries, even in our country, is contributing to economic development, employment, especially of the youth and women. And so we need to protect it, we need to promote it. But in this globalized world, there's also a risk, and this risk is recognized by UNESCO when it says globalization gives rise to unprecedented encounters between individuals, societies, and cultures, but at the same time raises fears of cultural standardization and the impoverishment of cultural diversity and pluralism. I think that is a major threat. And I would hate to come one day to India and not see the cultural vibrancy of your country, because that is what is making your country unique. That is what our culture makes us unique. And so we must be cautious that we don't assimilate other cultures to the extent that our own cultures die. And so yes, it's wonderful to be exposed to other cultures, but also protect your own. And I shall be concluding. How many minutes do I have, moderator? I do not want to disabuse your patience with me. I have 10 minutes left. Okay. You are too generous. And so, my dear friends, let us do just that. Preserve what makes India, India. Preserve what makes Africa, African. Preserve what makes us unique. So, culture's contribution is recognized in South Africa. I can quote you the statistics of what it contributes to our GDP, but I will not bore you. Our government also created what is called a master plan on the creative cultures, just giving further recognition of the role of culture in our economy, but also giving dignity. You know, people look down. They ask, what profession are you in? If you talk about culture, it's as if you don't have decent employment. And so we need to correct that, and and the master plan also seeks to use technology, ICT to support the promotion of culture. And I was quite impressed by one of the first speakers on the panel that indicated how they could use modern communication to promote culture, or what was perceived to be something dying, and giving it new life. So I think technology has a role, and India is best placed, I think, to teach all of us how we can do that. So we look forward to the outcomes of the G20 presidency under the Cultural Working Group also in that regard. And so, through that long detour, it brings me back to the priorities that India has set out for itself in the Cultural Working Group for this year: protecting and restituting of cultural property, harnessing living heritage for sustainable futures, promoting cultural and creative industries and creative economy, leveraging digital technology for protection and promotion of culture. And I think it was beautifully illustrated by one of the speakers during the first session, how they gave so many exposure to people in rural villages and performing on their own somewhere in India, and the whole globe can now see and experience that. And so as I conclude, with a vast and diverse experience around the table, I mean now the G20 table, with the guest countries also invited, we can learn from each other, we can share best practices, and we can put in place significant and important recommendations for policy development. The Indian presidency of the G20 can, through the work of the Cultural Working Group, demonstrate most powerfully that in spite of its cultural diversity, the vision of Prime Minister Modi of one earth, one family, one future can indeed be realized. In so doing, the G20 can thus contribute significantly and visibly the realization of the UN Charter objective, which is to promote social progress and better standards of life in larger freedom. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Mr. Crowley. And with that, I'll go across to Mr. Oleg Osipov for his opening remarks.
I would like to thank, first of all, Dr. Vijay Jolly for inviting me to this conference. Good afternoon, members of the Diplomatic Corps, ladies and gentlemen, colleagues and friends. So I was asked to speak about the G20 building cultural bridges. There is less talk about the cultural aspect of G20 activity than about the economic or political one. But for such a multifaceted, diverse structure as the G20, cultural nuances matter a lot. What is the definition of the G20? Club of governments and heads of central banks of the states with the most developed and developing economies. Not a word about culture. The G20 itself arose in the late 90s when Asian countries were gripped by a financial crisis and Western countries did not know how to react to it. And the very first culture summit in the format of G20 culture ministers took place only in 2021 in Rome. For more than 20 years, the G20 had no time for culture. There is something to think about here. In the public mind of different members of the G20, the very term culture is perceived differently. There is the English-speaking world, there is Africa, there is Indonesia, there is China, there is India, there is Russian world, a total of 20 such different civilizations. So we are not talking anymore about an average cultural code of the so-called golden billion. The third meeting of the G20 Culture Working Group was held recently in Hampi, Karnataka. Union Minister of Parliamentary Affairs and Coal and Mines, Shri Pralhad Joshi, addressed the session. The meeting has made substantial progress in their mission to prioritize culture in policymaking, moving from identifying and deliberating on 4 key priorities to seeking consensus on action-oriented recommendations. The G20 today already competes in a certain way with the G7. The press writes that in the future the leadership of the world economy will be in the competence not of the G7 but the G20. The cultures and philosophies of countries outside the G7 played their part, forcing the so-called collective West to engage in dialogue. In modern international relations, there is a huge potential of the so-called cultural attractiveness. That is why we observe the active involvement of the cultural sector in the foreign policy of states and international organizations. Another thing is that some players on the world stage consider culture as a tool for conducting modern offensive warfare. Media wars are a typical manifestation of this phenomenon. In 2016, the European Union, and let me remind you it is a member of G20, approved the new strategy for development of international cultural relations, in which a special role was assigned to culture. The next year, in March 2017, Florence hosted the first G7 International Cultural Summit, where the Florence Declaration was signed. Read the terms of this document, and you will understand that the involvement of culture in international relations proposed in this text leads to a change in the very concept of culture. It becomes more politicized, manipulative, and speculative in the rhetoric of politicians, journalists, and public figures. If we drop conventions, we can talk about the existence of modern methods of conducting an offensive cultural war. Some of these methods are destruction or discrimination of indigenous languages, introduction of discourses and discursive practices alien to society, abolition and creation of values, that is, the destruction of traditions and ideals that underlie the self-preservation of the social system, creation of artificial traditions and values that strengthen the influence of the cultural hegemon. These are not all points, there are others in the same vein. So, to my mind, it is extremely important for the G20 to be aware of such negative trends in the world and build bridges and not use culture, someone's own culture, as a means of coercion against those who have a different cultural code. The issue of cultural security, which is seen as the protection of the cultural diversity of minorities and the protection of social development from destructive tendencies, becomes especially relevant. Recall that the world community at the level of various international organizations recognize cultural diversity as a value and a non-market resource for the development of society. Its decrease has many negative consequences for the progress of human development and society. Initially, the concept of cultural safety was seen as an activity based on respect and support for the cultural identity of the community, its ancient traditions, current state and needs. But later, the concept was replaced by cultural security. Thus, the scope of the term is expanding, politicizing it. That is, in fact, the G20 is now at the beginning of its cultural journey. It needs to decide which way this club will go in terms of attitudes towards subtle matters. There is an option: solve other issues under the guise of culture or build reliable bridges. I want to steal the words of my colleague, Mr. Cedric Crowley, who said that culture must be inclusive, not exclusive. It means that, speaking mathematically, there should be no subtraction, only multiplication. Thank you.
Many thanks, Mr. Osipov. And with that, I'll go across to Ambassador Trigunayak now.
Namaste. Thank you, Maha, and distinguished panelists, esteemed audience. I'm thankful to Dr. Jolly and Sharma to inviting me for this, to share some of my thoughts. A lot has already been said since morning, so I won't like to repeat. But let us think about it. What is culture? How these shared beliefs, value systems are converted into an existence over years and last for centuries. One of the things that is most important to know about culture is that it is natural. Its osmosis is natural. It's essential and integral part of human existence and endeavor. It has been mentioned that perhaps a lot we have seen what we suffered. India has been, as they used to say, golden bird. And it has been looted repeatedly. And the last one was, of course, the colonialism. If you visit UK, for example, I was hoping to see the British gentlemen. And if you visit even their foreign office, the best part of the foreign office in the UK is the India section, which stands out. Half of it was actually built, not only the foreign office, but London reconstruction. So it's the wealth. And the cultural wealth is extremely important. We know there is a gray zone market. There is no regulation, despite the conventions. The cultural domination has been a dominant narrative for a pretty long time. But in India, we still think very differently. It has often been mentioned since morning, and again we hear, when we see the logo and the theme of the G20, that is Vasudhaiv Kutumbakam. One world, one future, one family. It is not only that. In fact, Prime Minister Modi has also been talking about, when we talk of energy, we talk of one world, one grid. When we talked about health, we talked about one world, one health. There is no distinction in human beings. We did not look at it from that angle. And that's why, when the pandemic happened, despite the fact that we possess 1/6 of the humanity, India was one of the first countries who went out to the world, provided whatever medicines were available to 150 countries. It is something that is in your DNA. Then when we had the vaccines, we not only manufactured, developed our own, but we provided to more than 100 countries. That is what India stands for. So when we see, as was mentioned by Mr. Osipov, we just had 2 days ago, the third meeting of this working group. And there is something that is happening. There are certain systems that are being evolved. The basic purpose is that there should be inclusivity. The culture must come around with each other. And as Dr. Jaishankar often mentions in the context of our relations with China, that this can only succeed if we have the 3 M's approach, which is mutual respect, mutual sensitivity, and mutual interest. So it's extremely important from that point of view. Let me quote Mahatma Gandhi when he said in 1936, April 5, he said that many of us are striving to produce a blend of all the cultures, which seems today to be in clash with one another. No culture can live if it attempts to be exclusive. And Indian culture is inclusive. It has grown over time with so many invasions, so many interactions that have happened. But the resilience of the Indian culture has survived, thrived, and stands on its own today, and is recognized all over the world. So no wonder when we went out to talk about yoga, everybody knew about yoga. Already in the United States, it's a very major industry in large number of countries. But to make it into an international day of yoga, or to make International Year of the Millets, this requires a global recognition of your competence as a nation, as a country, as a voice of the Global South, a voice of sanity in this world. And that all comes from part of the culture. So I would only, one last point is because we have heard about Kohinoor, when we talk of the stolen goods, there are a lot of controversy that goes around it. It's not being pushed far. But fortunately, because what decision this government has taken and pushed, we already have received from Australia and some other countries more than 29 artifacts. And India itself has given to Georgia, if you remember, External Affairs Minister had gone and the Queen Nityawan's relics which were here in India, they were handed over to Georgia by our External Affairs Minister. So the mutual respect, understanding, living together, common cause of the humanity are most important points that need to be carried forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Trugunayar. I'll first go across to Patriot Edinarato from Indonesia, and then the final comments will be made by Dr. Vijay Jolly.
Honorable guests, ladies and gentlemen, Namaskar. May peace and health be upon us all. A very good Friday to you all. On behalf of the Ambassador of Indonesia, we are truly honored to be invited by Dr. Vijay Jolly to deliver remarks at the Culture 20 Creative Economic Forum today, in which cultural cooperation can bridge countries' relations is by promoting mutual understanding and breaking down stereotypes. When individuals from different nations engage in cultural exchange, they are exposed to new perspectives, traditions, and ways of life. This exposure fosters empathy and respect for diversity. By embracing cultural differences, countries can enhance tolerance and acceptance, appreciation, as well as discouraging prejudice and discrimination, which then fostering an environment of trust and cooperation. Secondly, cultural cooperation also has the power to drive economic growth and prosperity. The exchange of cultural practices, knowledge, and ideas can fuel innovation, entrepreneurship, and tourism. By embracing cultural engagement, countries can tap into new markets, attract investment, and boost their economies. Moreover, collaborative efforts in the fields of education, science, and technology can lead to groundbreaking discoveries and advancements that benefit humanity as a whole. Thirdly, cultural cooperation can be an effective force for peace building and conflict resolution. History has shown that conflicts often arise from a lack of understanding and miscommunication. By facilitating cultural exchanges, countries can create spaces for dialogue, reconciliations, and curing of historical wounds. Through shared experiences and the appreciation of each other's cultures, countries can build bridges of understanding and pave the way for lasting peace and harmonious world. Secondly, allow me now to touch upon the relations and collaboration between India and Indonesia. To give you a concrete proof why cultural relations as well as people-to-people contact are important. Indonesia and India share a rich and long-standing relations which was built on historic ties and civilizational interaction for more than 2 millennia. Many examples can be found to explain these strong linkages. Among others are maritime trade routes, the architecture of temples in Indonesia, such as Prambanan and Borobudur, absorption of Sanskrit words to our national language, the stories of Ramayana and Mahabharata, which are still widely taught and part of our daily life, and etc. The strong socio and cultural linkages in the past have made our relation vigorous. It is also laid out an important foundation for our present and future cooperation. The shared history of colonialism also brought our two nations very close to each other. History demonstrates that in the mid-1940s and 1950s, our forefathers were mutually supportive in their efforts to create a world free of colonialism and imperialism. Even before India had attained independence in 1947, India had supported Indonesia's struggle for independence during the 1945 to 1949, which Indonesian people has never forgotten. India played a significant role in the efforts to give pressures to the colonial power to withdraw themselves from their pursuit of restoring empire in Indonesia. Fast forward to the recent decades, the friendly relation between Indonesia and India continues to this day. Next year, Indonesia and India will be celebrating the 75th anniversary of diplomatic relations. Indonesia and India have been experiencing intensive engagements since the leveling up of the bilateral relations into comprehensive strategic partnership and shared the vision of maritime cooperation in the Indo-Pacific in 2018. In the economic sector, the bilateral trade between Indonesia and India in 2022 reached 32.7 billion US dollar, which is an all-time high. Both countries have set the target of bilateral trade of 50 billion US dollar in 2025. Meanwhile, India's investment in Indonesia stood at around 1.5 billion US dollar in the last 2 decades. This figure could be much larger as some investors might use third countries to invest in Indonesia. In the tourism sector, India is among the top 5 sources of tourists to Indonesia. There have been 100,000 of people from India which visited Indonesia every year. Most of them visited Bali Island. I believe the number of Indian tourists in Indonesia will increase significantly in the next future. As recently, some Indian airways, such as Vistara and Indigo, opened their direct flight route to Indonesia. Both countries are also a close partner in the G20. Last year, Indonesia was chairing the presidency, while this year, Indonesia is part of the G20 Troika with India as the president. As a member of the Troika, Indonesia stands ready to support India to ensure the success of the summit in New Delhi on September 2023. As the COVID-19 pandemic now reaches the endemic stage, Indonesia and India emerged as among of a few nations with robust economic growth. IMF have forecasted that India will grow by 5.9% and Indonesia will grow by 5% in 2023. It is far above the forecasted global GDP growth of 2.8% in 2023. If the current economic trajectory is on track, India is on course to become the world's 3rd largest economy in the world by 2030. Similarly, IMF projected that Indonesia will become the 5th largest economy in the world in 2030 also. With those projections, it is important to note that stronger Indonesia and India relations in the coming future will be beneficial, not only for both countries, but also to the region and the world. The 21st century is said to be the Asian century. With our commonalities in the values of democracy, pluralism, non-alignment, as well as robust economies, both countries are deemed able to shape the future of the Asian century. My last highlight is on young people. Both Indonesia and India boast a youthful population. Our combined population are massive, almost 1.7 billion people. The youth are the torchbearers of the future, and their active participation and engagement can significantly contribute to promoting understanding, harmony, and collaboration across cultures. With approximately 60% of Indonesia's population and 65% of India's population are being under the age of 35. So I believe the youth demographic holds the key to shaping the destiny of our nations. Both Indonesia and India should tap into our demographic bonus. To harness the power of youth, Indonesia and India should continuously strive to build an even stronger people-to-people partnership by leveraging the already solid historical, political, and economic footprints. The youth are the driving force of progress, innovation, and change. The youth are also the catalyst for economic growth and development. In an increasingly interconnected global economy, the youth are the source of entrepreneurship, innovation, and technological advancement. For example, the youth of India and Indonesia have been instrumental in the country's digital revolution, such as payment system, propelling the growth of the IT sector, e-commerce, and empower small and medium enterprises, etc. I believe that our countries could find opportunities by advancing the collaboration in these fields. Several ways in which the youth could foster cultural cooperation and build the bridge among nations are: first, cultural exchange programs, cultural festivals such as arts, music, dance, etc. Using social media platforms positively to showcasing their cultural heritage. Forming youth-led cultural organizations and promoting education and intercultural learning. In today's interconnected world, where social media and technology bring us closer than ever before, cultural cooperation has become increasingly accessible. People can now connect with people from all corners across the globe, exchange ideas, and learn from each other's experiences with just a few clicks. It is our responsibility to harness this power and leverage it to strengthen the bonds between nations. Indonesia stands ready to cooperate with India for the development of our youth. Both countries could pave the way for its youth to appreciate intercultural differences by fostering meaningful engagement. This, in turn, will create trust, build understanding that in the future will be beneficial for our future relation. To conclude, I would like to once again thank you for this opportunity, and I wish the success of the program. Thank you. Namaste.
Many thanks, Mr. Nato. Last closing comments now by Dr. Vijay Jolly. We have the last 8 minutes left, so I'll request you, sir, to keep it brief. I'm sorry, since you're the last speaker here, but we'd like to ask a couple of questions.
Thank you, Maha. Thank you, NDTV, for moderating this session. I will try to be as brief as possible and sum up my comments in another 4 minutes. G20, the presidency being with India, and 85% of the global GDP, 75% of the global trade, and 2/3 of the world population exist in G20 nations. I'm very happy that senior diplomats from Indonesia, the country which headed the G20 in the last session as the president. Of course, India now taking over the presidency, and our Prime Minister, the global world-renowned popular leader, Dr. Narendra Damodar Das Modi, assuming the presidency's chairmanship. My dear friend from Russia, Oleg. My dear friend from South Africa, Mr. Cedric. And the esteemed Indian ambassadors, Ambassador Soni and Ambassador Anil. In their presence, I wish to state the biggest challenge in front of the G20 this year should be to broker a peace accord on the troubled turmoil relationship between Russia and Ukraine. Because we want world peace to coexist, which can certainly bring about a radical change in the world interactions. Interactions on the health sector, the health care, agriculture, finance, terrorism, trade, tourism, generating energy. This time is to all join hands together in a quest for peace and development in the world. After having visited 90 countries of the globe, as a citizen of India, I firmly believe addressing, talking, walking, having a dialogue, even with diverse partners in any sphere of life, can certainly bring in positive results. I know the time is a big constraint today, but Maha, I will not add up to your woes that I keep on speaking. With such a illuminist gathering over here, I only wish to state the last point. I am proud to be a citizen of Republic of India, which is having the G20 presidency this year, and today my Prime Minister is being felicitated in great France. That gives upon a certain added responsibility to all we Indian friends to coexist in every dialogue which can usher in a global peace and development, not only in our part of the world, but all over the globe. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Vijay Jolly, for keeping it really brief. We have the last couple of minutes left, so I'll just put across a couple of questions only. To both the speakers here from South Africa and Russia, both of you spoke about how culture can be politicized, it can be used as a means of dominance as well. So from you, I want to know, in this G20 summit that we'll see and in the run-up where so many meetings are being held, what are the two solutions you'll give for building bridges?
Well, thank you for the question. Well, I think that, first of all, more attention must be given to culture in the framework of the G20 as a whole. And G20 shouldn't repeat those mistakes made by other organizations. I have already named them. It's G7, the European Union, when they impose their cultural will on the others. Russia has never had a colonial history. There is a saying that when the Russians advanced, they left behind them universities, hospitals, and theaters. So, and we can see that in the example of, for example, the Middle Asian republics like Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, and others. Now they're separate states, and it's okay. So I think that culture should be one of, when making politics, yes, it's it's an economic organization, I mean G20, but making politics and economics, they always should think a little bit about how will it affect the cultural aspects of their activity.
All right.
Thank you.
Mr. Crowley?
Thank you for that question. There are a few basic principles we can draw from our own history, and since it's Mandela Month, I will promote him. So we must recognize that there are differences. We must sit together, communicate, dialogue, negotiate, and look at the bigger picture. If we are all looking from a narrow national perspective, I don't think that solutions will be easily come by. If that was the case, our negotiations in 1994 would certainly, that ushered in the democratic government, would certainly not have happened. So it's that statesmanship role. We are here, there's a world out there that is suffering economically. People are starving, people are hungry. Certainly the G20, if it has to assume this role that it has ascribed to itself, if it wants to show leadership, then it must look beyond its own differences and look at the billions of people that are suffering. And that would be my solution. Thank you.
Many thanks. Ambassador Trigunayat, I want to pose a question to you as well. When there are large challenges that are being faced by the world with regards to the global economy, do you think culture can even take a front seat in that scenario?
Well, the culture and cultural economy are also an integral part of the overall economy. I mean, if you see the UNCTAD report, it said about 40% of the total economy of the developing world is actually the cultural economy. So we cannot. The problem of the global economic downturn is, and that fortunately the world is slowly coming out of it, is that we need to have a balanced and a holistic approach to these things. You know, I mean, it has been mentioned that it's not a domination of culture even from abroad in countries, but it also happens within countries. So those are the things that need to be, like for example, a lot of handicrafts and others in India, you know, it's a very major industry. It had a patronage. Now the new government policies have come up, which are trying to promote those. So they can play a very important role also.
I think we'll have to leave it at that. We've completely run out of time. I don't want to antagonize the organizers because the program is already running late. But many thanks to all of you for joining us here on this panel. Thank you.
Thank you so much, panelists. Thank you so much, Maha. May I request Ms. Supriya Suri to please present mementos to all the esteemed panelists. And a big round of applause to this very, very interesting session.